Welcome to the 5th video in this module. In this video, we will be discussing 5 principles of brain development, which will help us to better understand complex or developmental trauma. So let's get started. In this video, I would like to cover 5 different principles of brain development. The first principle is that the brain develops in a very specific sequence. The brain has 4 general systems. There's this fight or flight system, which is characterized mostly by adrenaline. There's this reward system, which is characterized mostly by dopamine. We have this friend and tend system, which is characterized mostly by oxytocin. And then finally, we have what's called this cognitive control system. I'm going to call these 4 different brain systems the survival brain, the emotion brain, the attachment brain, and the cognitive brain. Now, what we know about brain development is the brain develops in that specific order. First the survival brain, then the emotion brain, then the attachment brain, and then the cognitive brain. The survival brain regulates everything we do automatically. That refers to functions such as digestion, respiration, circulation, etc. The survival brain is also responsible for fight, flight, freeze, basically our automatic instinctual response to danger or crisis. That's the first part of the brain to develop, the survival brain. Each stage of brain development affects all subsequent brain development for better or for worse. When a child is growing up in a healthy, stable environment, the conditions are ripe for healthy brain development. And the survival brain is developing fairly stable and contained because there's not a lot of things that are triggering the survival brain. But even if the survival brain is triggered, it is co-regulated by a nurturing caregiver. In other words, the survival brain is fairly stable, fairly contained. And that is the ideal foundation for the next brain system to develop, the emotion brain. Assuming a stable survival brain, the emotion brain now has the luxury to fully develop as it's supposed to. And it has the luxury of developing a full spectrum of positive and negative emotions, which is the perfect foundation for the next system to develop, the attachment brain. And as we know, relationships, attachments are complex and require the full spectrum of emotions. If we have that full spectrum of emotions, now we have a really strong foundation to develop secure attachments, right? A healthy attachment brain. And the final stage of brain development is the cognition brain. This is the part that's responsible for developing beliefs about self, others, and the world. If there's a strong attachment brain, the person will have relatively positive beliefs about the self, others, and the world. The cognition brain is also responsible for balanced decision making. In other words, this ability to think about cause and effect, pros and cons, long-term versus short-term. In other words, to be dialectical. If all of these brain systems are balanced and the person has a healthy cognition brain, this person will be a dialectical person. But what happens when a child is not growing up in that sort of environment? Well, that brings us to principle number 2. Principle number 2 is neurons and neural systems are designed to change in a use-dependent fashion. What that means is the brain follows the same use it or lose it principle as any other muscle. For example, if you go to the gym 5 hours a day to work out, eventually you'll start to resemble Arnold Schwarzenegger. On the other hand, if you haven't been to a gym in 10 or 15 years, unfortunately, you'll probably start to look like me. The brain is the same way. If you use certain parts of it, those parts will overdevelop. If you don't use certain parts, those parts will atrophy. That's exactly what happens with someone that is growing up in a household in which there is constant trauma, abuse, neglect, etc. The first thing that happens is the survival brain overdevelops. It becomes very good at executing fight, flight, freeze. Why? Because it needs to. But once the survival brain overdevelops, that's going to have a ripple effect on the rest of brain development. When we get to the emotion brain, 2 things happen. One thing is positive emotions underdevelop. Why is that? Well, if you think about it, you don't need positive emotions to execute fight, flight, freeze. Furthermore, the child might even learn that positive emotions are bad. For example, if I love daddy, but daddy's abusing me, maybe love is not such a good thing. So positive emotions underdevelop. On the other hand, negative emotions overdevelop. And two negative emotions in particular, fear and anger. Why is that? It's because you do need fear and anger in order to execute fight, flight, freeze. As you can see so far, brain development is being skewed. And once again, this will have a ripple effect on subsequent brain development. The next part to develop is the attachment brain. The attachment brain will be underdeveloped as a result of the low positive emotions and the high negative emotions. How in the world are you going to develop strong, healthy, secure attachments if you only have fear and anger to work with? That's not going to work. That's why people who have experienced chronic trauma in childhood tend to develop insecure attachments, fear of abandonment, also this whole I hate you but don't leave me complex. And once again, this is actually highly practical because someone that's growing up in this toxic, hostile environment has learned that relationships are part of the problem. And then finally, the last part of the brain to develop is the cognition brain. As a direct result of how everything has played out so far, what we see is negative beliefs overdevelop, especially negative beliefs about the self, others, and the world. In addition, what happens in the cognition brain is that decision-making underdevelops, which leads to impulsivity. And that leads us to principle number 3. Principle number 3 states that the brain is organized in a hierarchical fashion such that all incoming sensory input first enters the lower parts of the brain. Practically speaking, not only does the brain develop in a very specific order, but the brain also processes all incoming information in that same exact order, in the specific sequence of survival brain, emotion brain, attachment brain, cognition brain. But remember, someone that's been traumatized, their survival brain, emotion brain, attachment brain, and cognition brain have been either over or underdeveloped. So as they are receiving incoming information, all that information is being skewed in those different directions. For example, what do you think happens to someone who has been chronically traumatized when they're presented with neutral or even positive information? What do you think happens to that information by the time it filters through fight, flight, and freeze from the survival brain, followed by fear and anger from the emotion brain, followed by insecure attachments, and then it finally reaches the thinking part of the brain. But even then, the information is further skewed by negative beliefs about the self, others, and the world. Do you see the profound implications of this principle? All incoming information is being highly skewed in all of these different ways. Principle number 4 is the brain develops rapidly early in life, very rapidly. A child's brain is 90% the adult size by age 4. So what does this have to do with trauma? I would like to throw out a language analogy for you to think about. One example of extremely rapid brain growth is the ability of little kids to absorb their native language. It is probably the most complex thing we do as humans. To this day, nobody understands how this works. It's actually one of the mysteries of the human experience that we still don't understand. But regardless, it's an example of this rapid brain growth that happens early on in life. So, what happens if a child is experiencing constant chronic trauma in those early years? The brain is literally learning all of that trauma and all of those trauma responses just as permanently and automatically as their own native language. That's extremely sobering to think about. And that probably also seems very pessimistic, but that brings us to principle number 5. This is finally a glimmer of hope here. Principle number 5 states that neural systems can be changed, but some systems are easier to change than others. Let's go back to our language analogy. As we know, when we learn our own native language as kids, that just happens automatically. We don't have to study vocab. We don't have to study verb conjugations. A 3-year-old, 4-year-old is just absorbing language automatically. Don't even have to think about grammar. But what happens if you want to learn another language as an adult? It can happen, but it's hard work. That's exactly what it's like for our clients who have been chronically traumatized in childhood. It is possible for them to learn new skills and to rewire their original neurological connections. It is possible, but it's hard work. It's like learning another language as an adult. You do have to study grammar, memorize vocab, study verb conjugations, and learn about different tenses. It can be done, but it's going to be hard work. And that's precisely what trauma-focused DBT is all about. It's learning the grammar, so to speak, of a balanced life that some of our clients did not learn as kids, since their native language was different. Their native language was the language of trauma, the language of extreme experiences and extreme responses. That's their native language. They can learn a new language, and that's actually what trauma-focused DBT is. If you literally contrast a chronically abused brain versus a healthy brain, you will literally notice physiological differences. For example, in a traumatized brain, you'll notice an overdeveloped hindbrain, the back part of the brain, which is what drives survival functions such as fight, flight, freeze. You'll also notice parts of the limbic system that are both under and overdeveloped. The limbic system is responsible for emotions and attachments. You'll also notice an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for awareness, rational thought, and decision making. And it's because of all these different brain principles that we just talked about, and specifically how trauma affects brain development, that we end up with physiological dysregulation, attentional dysregulation, emotional dysregulation, behavioral dysregulation, and relational dysregulation, both with self and others. Let's wrap up with a few key points from this video. First key point. The brain develops in a very specific sequence: the survival brain, emotion brain, attachment brain, and cognition brain. Each stage of brain development is foundational for the subsequent stages. Chronic trauma, which occurs while the brain is still developing, has a profound effect on all brain systems. Key point number 2. Children who are exposed to chronic trauma experience overdeveloped survival brains, especially the fight, flight, freeze response. This initiates a chain reaction that affects the rest of brain development, in which positive emotions underdevelop, negative emotions overdevelop, attachments underdevelop, negative beliefs overdevelop, and awareness and decision-making underdevelop. And our final key point. Not only does the brain develop in a specific sequence, but the brain also processes all incoming information in the same exact order. Therefore, trauma survivors continue to process their present reality through the filters of fight, flight, freeze, fear and anger, insecure attachments, negative beliefs, and impulsive decision-making. That's why healing from trauma requires stabilization of all of these different brain symptoms, which is the entire purpose of trauma-focused DBT.